The harrowing story of benzodiazepine drugs can fittingly begin with this extraordinary icon of hope, the Angel of the North, a sculpture by Anthony Gormley, dramatically adorning Gateshead and Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. It's a striking image for the home of Professor Heather Ashton, who has become a veritable Angel of the North for those who have suffered and are still suffering from the terrifying nightmare caused by taking benzodiazepines, Valium, Ativan, Xanax, Klonopin, and hundreds of others prescribed by their doctors. The many side effects are painful and agonizing and can last for years, perhaps permanently. There's evidence pointing to brain damage which the drug companies, health agencies, and governments ignore. Professor Ashton is joined by another leading international expert, Professor Malcolm Lader, OBE, in giving exclusive interviews for this documentary, helping to expose this disgraceful scandal which has persisted for over half a century.
It's a medical disaster. We've had many before, and we'll have many again, but at least we can try and rectify that disaster, or at least rectify the effects of that disaster.
It is a medical disaster. It's a pandemic, actually. It's like an illness all over the world of overprescription of drugs. And the reason is partly because doctors don't think what they're prescribing, number one. Number two, pushing by the drug companies. Number two, and number three, not enough research.
At the present moment, we have this large group. We've got to try and set up facilities to help them come off the medication if they should want. We need to develop alternative methods of treatment which don't expose people to pharmacological dangers, and we need to compensate them if we've made a mistake.
In Newcastle, Professor Ashton set up a clinic for benzodiazepine victims. The drugs are anxiolytic and hypnotic, relieving acute anxiety and insomnia. But disastrously, the actual use has been extended by doctors, used as a muscle relaxant and for pains, sports injuries, normal life stresses like bereavement, tinnitus, and in my case it was for Meniere's disease, an inner ear problem. Despite overwhelming evidence of dangers, doctors, health authorities and governments have failed to protect citizens from this crime against humanity. Unbelievably, after more than 50 years, new victims worldwide every year are being led by their doctors into this vortex of pain and suffering, completely avoidable if prescribing is sharply curtailed by law, and patients, by law, are clearly and strongly warned of the dangers.
This was a real, and still is, a real tragedy. As I say, people lose their jobs, their income, their relationships, their marriages.
What we need, I think, is a wake-up call where we find people who are showing signs of brain damage, even if it's just functionally to start with, and that this would act as a catalyst.
Drug companies now do list a lot of side effects, but what they don't tell you is that for a significant number of benzodiazepine sufferers, potentially millions worldwide over half a century, the symptoms, particularly the physical and painful, do not go away and can be crippling for years. In some cases, I think you suggested it was 10 to 15% of those suffering from withdrawal symptoms. They have protracted withdrawal symptoms. The symptoms go on for longer than a year, and sometimes for years, and possibly even permanently.
Yes, that's only an estimate though. There were some who didn't seem to recover fully, but most of them lost their anxiety. But there were people who still had muscle pains, muscle spasms, mostly physical things actually, but they'd lost their anxiety and depression and nightmares and all those. The mental systems went, but the physical symptoms tended to be long-term.
Yes, now this is even more contentious, what we call the persistent withdrawal syndrome. And we described that, and so did Heather Ashton, many years ago, and we were concerned about this. Now, I laid down quite firm criteria. I said that this would have to be a condition in which somebody stopped the medication, developed a withdrawal syndrome of the symptoms I've just mentioned, but those symptoms persisted. I didn't see this coming on as a separate syndrome later with a gap of symptom-free, but there are variations on this.
Some people do get permanent, well, feels like permanent symptoms. We don't know the causes of them. Nobody's ever looked at them. So we just need to do some research on that, but we haven't.
As you know, I myself am suffering from long-term side effects of benzodiazepines. It means that I can't walk very much. In some cases, I can't walk at all. I'm suffering from electric currents running through my body, also electric shocks. Is that common? Have you come across those kind of symptoms in your work?
Well, yes, I have, certainly, and those ones do seem to be protracted. And the interesting thing is, in this age where everybody's having antidepressants now, SSRIs like Prozac, they can produce similar symptoms, including this electricity feeling. And one wonders that if we ever get rid of benzos, whether another lot of drugs won't take over and be just as bad. Certainly some of the short-acting Prozac-like drugs are. And yes, I've had patients with sort of explosive headaches, as if there's an electric current running up and boom, like a thunderclap in the brain, yes.
There were also cases presenting, weren't there, of people whose symptoms didn't go away. They suffer a withdrawal syndrome, and the symptoms can be prolonged, go on for a year, and possibly even permanently.
Yes, I still get emails quite frequently from people from all over the world saying that they have been withdrawn from their tranquilizer or their sleeping tablet, from their Valium, their Ativan, their Clonopin, whatever, and they developed symptoms, and those symptoms have persisted. They're usually a little less, but they may not have gone away after several years.
In Britain alone, it's estimated that up to 1.5 million people are on long-term prescription of benzodiazepines. Many are probably frightened to stop because of the appalling side effects, and even while taking the drugs, they can suffer withdrawal illness from tolerance. An important study recently shows that long-term users have a 50% increased risk of Alzheimer's. The serious long-term harm caused by benzodiazepines is compared to the infamous thalidomide scandal.
These protracted or permanent side effects of benzodiazepines have never been fully investigated. A prominent victim, Colm Downes-Granger, has said that this is a scandal like thalidomide.
Yes, you could compare it to thalidomide. It is more common, probably. And the health service and the government, and to some extent the doctors that ignored it, yes. And certainly it was a tragedy as bad. It still is, as thalidomide. But it's, as you say, it's hidden because people say, oh, you look well, but they don't know what you're feeling like inside.
Do you think Hoffmann-La Roche has a responsibility, a moral responsibility in this area?
Whether they have a moral responsibility, of course, is a different matter. I'm not a moral philosopher. I would hope that they would take some responsibilities seriously and out of their past profits finance some useful studies. Essentially, they need to start with an epidemiological study. That is, you need to look, seeing what's going on out there in real life, how many people starting on medications of this type and are running into trouble. That can be done because we have research organizations which monitor medication and can be tapped into to see what the outcomes are.
In the 1980s, you told the BBC that withdrawing from benzodiazepines was much more difficult than withdrawing from heroin.
Yes, that's true. And I would often, in collaboration with some colleagues, take people who had addiction problems with the benzodiazepines, but also addiction problems with heroin or cocaine or whatever, amphetamines, and we found that it was actually easier for people to withdraw from heroin with help than it was for them to come off the benzodiazepines.
What was the response to those remarks?
Oh, I think it was just generally disbelief. Everybody thinks it's very difficult to get off heroin, yet people are doing it all the time. They're admitted to prison, and they even go cold turkey, but usually there's some help. So it's not that difficult to come off heroin. Benzodiazepines can be much more of a problem, particularly in the minority, which I've mentioned, that have severe withdrawal reactions and may become persistent.
And you referred in your recent paper that you've written about benzodiazepines, you referred to those people suffering an agony. Is that the way it appeared to you when you were listening to case histories being described to you? Because people do say it's like going through hell, and I experienced this myself.
Yes, I think that's so. I think the people who are getting a severe reaction, the symptoms are so complex, they're so diffuse, so persistent, they're so interfering with day-to-day life that they are an agony. But I emphasize that most people don't get to that degree of severity.
But Professor Leder and others say that the minority who can have a severe reaction could be up to 30%. The symptoms are myriad. In her clinic, Professor Ashton recorded the many distressing conditions.
Pain, limbs, back and neck. Pain, teeth and jaw. Paresthesia, stabbing pins and needles. Limbs and face. Stiffness, limbs, back and jaw. Tremor, muscle pain, twitches. Dizziness, tinnitus, hypersensitivity to sound, light, touch and taste, fits, seizures, anxiety, depression, poor memory and concentration, insomnia, nightmares, hallucinations, agoraphobia and other phobias, panic attacks and palpitations, abdominal pain, diarrhea, constipation. All patients complained of difficulty walking. This appeared to result from a combination of sensory disturbance, muscle weakness, pain and stiffness. Pain in various parts of the body was prominent. Neck pain and occipital headache, pain in the limbs described as aching, bursting, cutting, were all common and often severe. Paresthesiae. All patients had feelings of pins and needles, tingling, crawling in the skin, numbness or altered sensation at some time, usually affecting the limbs in a glove and stocking distribution.
As the eminent Irish expert Dr. John O'Connor says about benzodiazepine withdrawal, the body becomes its own personal torture chamber. Ironically, benzodiazepines replaced the dangerous barbiturates.
There was the move to the benzodiazepines, which seemed safer in overdose and also didn't seem to produce the same addiction problems, and they became very popular indeed. Names like Mother's Little Helper, and doctors were prescribing them very widely and I think indiscriminately.
So they thought, well, benzodiazepines don't kill anybody, so we can give them with absolute certitude they'll be safe. But they didn't think that they might be addictive and have other characteristics, because they worked very similarly to barbiturates.
I wrote a textbook about that time in the 1960s, and I went back to have a look at what I said, and I was urging caution there. I just didn't believe these ideas that somehow the benzodiazepines were totally safe.
So the companies obviously didn't research these drugs thoroughly enough before they went on the market. Why do you think that is?
Well, we have to remember this went on in the 1950s, the marketing was in the 1960s, and the requirements at those days were much more lax than they are now. Sometimes wonder whether Valium could have even been